So now I cannot say anything bad anymore. Okay, so the first thing is, right, this is just one man's perspective on this topic. Um, I'll the first slide I will give a bit more thoughts on the type of work I've done. So this to some extent also gives you my perspective, right? There's a lot of different flavors for research. To some extent, what I say is, I would say, generally applicable, but to some extent, things are, more or less, certain aspects are more or less important depending on what type of work you do, right? So, but hopefully it's going to be giving something for everybody, right? Having said that, it's not meant to be like an exhaustive talk on everything you might possibly want to consider when you're writing a literature review. So, there's a bunch of thoughts here. I'll be curious. I think we've scheduled 90 minutes, but the first 10 minutes are down the tubes. So we have probably 75 minutes left. So, I don't expect to talk for 75 minutes without interruption. I'll be happy to take questions either in the middle or at the end, and so on, right? Okay, so with that, then just ah, okay. So, Hamid already said a couple of words about my work. So I think like if you want to position my work in the vast landscape of OR, OM, IE, and so on, right? Um, I would say so. This sort of my summary is like modeling, analyzing, and then optimizing systems where the key is that they're congestion prone. So that tells you there's limited capacity, right? Maybe there's variability, so that leads to delay, and um, you might lose throughput, you might have delays, right? And people care in some ways, customers care about that delay in their service selection decisions and so on, right? So some of the questions or decisions that would come up that I've looked at is things like pricing, service design, how should we have multiple priority classes and so on? How should we schedule for different classes, and maybe match customers and supply and servers. Um, okay. And then, I'm particularly interested in sort of the interplay between operations, but then also like decentralized incentives. So customers, you can't just tell them what to do. They're choosing between the options that they have. And maybe there's sometimes also information aspects that are interesting. How do I get rid of this? Okay. All right. And so I think that to me, this interplay, if it gives rise to some, new insights or results on how we should run things, that's one of the things that I find interesting. Um, Now, initially, I've looked at sort of pure theory. Now, if a mathematician looks at this, they're like, this is not pure theory, probably, but it's like, it's like theoretical models and analysis of these models. And more recently, I've sort of focused also in on specific types of applications and also more like data-driven stuff. But the three samples that I will give you at the second part of the talk will be all in the sort of, pure sort of theory modeling papers, right? Okay, so this is sort of the roadmap, right? So I think first we should say, okay, what are we trying to accomplish? What are the goals of the literature review? And then, the title says a simple framework. So framework is not rocket science. It's just you have lots of thoughts about how to do this. And I'm just trying to organize them in some way that's, more or less systematic, right? So once we have the goals, we want to probably search, identify potentially relevant literature. You would then read or skim and evaluate these papers and then organize them. Maybe you need to do a selection and then write the review, right? So I'll say a few words on each of these and then give you for three examples not the whole thing, but just like, a couple of um, issues or challenges at the time that were relevant to these examples and how we sort of dealt with them in those literature reviews, right? And then at the end, some common mistakes to avoid. Okay, so here, instead of lecturing, I'd be curious to hear both from people who are physically here or from people who are in outer space. Um, like in your mind, what are the goals of the literature review? Yes?
Finding the gap in the literature.
Okay, finding the gaps. By the way, can you guys hear this online?
Yes, we can. Yes.
You can hear participants responding?
Yes,
Yes,
yes, we can.
yes.
Great. Okay, great. So, right, so one comment was finding the gaps. If you're typing in the chat, I don't see it. I mean, thank you for typing in the chat, but then, right? Anything else? So, I mean, that's the, probably the, right? So finding, but then not just finding, right? You want to actually identify and state gaps and so on, right? Okay, positioning the work, like how does it fit relative to the literature, right? Anything else? Yes.
Set common knowledge base for the reader.
Okay.
Make sure that everybody is speaking on the same.
Okay, like set a reference, like, okay, this is what we know. Like readers come from different backgrounds, different knowledge, right? You kind of at least convey to them, this is what I think has been done, and this is what I think, how I think my work fits in there, right? So at least the reader, maybe they don't agree, but at least you communicate it to them so they can take this and then say, well, actually, I agree, or there's something missing, right? And if we don't do that, then, they don't know, right? Anyone in Zoom wants to say something?
To learn about the basics and find out about the methodologies, maybe.
Okay, so now is this for you doing the literature review or when you write it?
When you write it.
Okay,
Uh,
so
no, when you read it, I'm sorry.
okay, by the way, who's speaking?
I'm Negar
And you're at which
in the Zoom,
excuse me?
in the Zoom meeting.
No, I know, but we we cannot see you here. But your affiliation?
Um, she, her.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right, so seeing like learning what has been done methodologically and so on, right? And of course, we want to then tell this to the reader. Is there anything else that you can think of? Yes, Danielle?
I would say that the answer I would give formally is sort of just an overview. You want to give an overview of the field, but I think the answer informally would be to not to include everyone relevant, so you don't alienate any of your reviewers
Okay.
down the road.
Okay, so that's an interesting one, right? So so Danielle here said, okay, other than the official or in addition to the official task, is also, by the way, I should probably give credit to people in the field, right? And I mean, people are to different degrees sensitive about not being cited and so on, right? Right. And so this can actually be important, right, to a degree. Also, if you have some ideas of who will be a referee or reviewer and so on, right? So absolutely, right? So I mean, I think that's important, right? Is probably not the only thing you want to keep in mind, but it's one thing that I think like you should have like your checklist, and let's say you've done your preliminary work, you then say, okay, are there any names here that aren't included and should be, right? I mean, sometimes people think, oh, but my paper should always be cited. It's like, well, no, it's actually completely irrelevant here, right? So those are a little bit delicate situations, right? Is there anything else you can think of? So maybe if you put yourselves in the shoes of reading a paper, right? Now, of course,
To
like when I start reading a paper, if I want to just know about the meat of the paper, I just skip to the model, right? But if you're actually trying to learn from a literature review about the background and the context for the paper, like as a reader, I'm sure you've had many experiences doing this, whether you skimmed or you read in detail. Like, what sort of impression do you walk away depending on the quality of the literature review?
To develop the knowledge base.
No, but like, what is your impression about the paper, depending on how the review was written? Do you have it like, does it leave you completely neutral, or do you have some, positive or negative reactions? I mean, of course, I'm asking you leading questions, but Hamid,
I shouldn't answer because
oh, you see,
that's my impression when I read the literature review is basically understanding the depths of knowledge and the strengths of the authors
Okay.
of the subject.
All right.
So one goal of the whole literature review could be showcase your current understanding of the current literature and then how you're building up on that.
Yes, yeah. So I think this, I mean, and yeah, you've seen it before, right? So, but that's where I was going with this. Now, we can argue how important that is, right? I mean, if you have a super strong paper and your literature review is sort of mediocre, I mean, probably it's going to get published and people would just tell you, oh, maybe you should add a few references you missed, right? But I think it never hurts, and it can only help for your literature review also to convey that you actually know what you're doing, you know what you're not doing, you know how what you're doing compares to what other people did. And the more Hmm? Oh, okay. Thank you. And I would say this becomes particularly important if there's closely related work, right? Because then it's not just, oh, you know about other papers, but you can actually explain, if needed, at a very technical level, why what has been done is different from what you did and why we should care about the thing you're adding to what has been done, right? And so, like sometimes you read papers and it's like, they kind of mention the right papers, but then they don't like explain, okay, so how is this actually different and why should I care, right? So, right, so this is kind of a summary, and I think we touched on all of these. If there's further
I
comments,
had a question.
yes, please.
Yeah, this is Omar from McMaster.
Okay, hi, Omar.
Yeah, so, do we review literature which is generally aligned with what our claims are, or do we also look at some opposing views as well?
Well, I mean, I would say if do you have some specific thing in mind, like a paper you're working on, or is it just a general question?
Just a general question.
Okay. I mean, I think I think you know, if the paper studies either the same question or a related question, right? I think absolutely you want to cite papers that come to different conclusions, right? And in fact, part of your contribution might be that, and sometimes we have the kind of contribution statement that has the following flavor. It's conventional wisdom that for this type of problem, the right thing to do is to do X. Like, for example, speaking of queuing, like, oh, this it's generally understood that it's usually a good thing to have like to pool multiple queues so that you get more efficient use of the facilities, right? However, in our paper, we find that that's not the case, and so on and so forth, right? So I think absolutely, I think the filter is not whether the results are the same or contradict yours. The filter would be, are they studying a similar question? Are they studying maybe a different question for a similar system, and so on, right? And there's always going to be some judgment call, right? Like, I mean, at some point, certain things are clearly related, certain things are clearly not related, and then there's some middle ground. Does that make sense? Omar?
Yes, thank you.
Right. So the first one is, I think, the most obvious one, right? The second one, I think, is where Danielle was going, right? So I think here also, I mean, this is a bit delicate, right? Because you can definitely make a mistake in not, like, objectively speaking, you can make a mistake in failing to cite papers, right? Because it's like, oh, basically clearly relevant papers, if you don't cite them, it's basically, oh, these people actually have no clue, right? Or they were lazy or they're ignorant, and none of these things are like good, good reactions from the reader, right? And then sometimes it's, you have certain very sensitive people if their paper isn't cited, even though it's not really relevant. But so, at least I would say, look at the list you have, look at the people who are maybe potential referees or like work in this area, have done a lot of work, and then ask yourself carefully, right? It may also make sense to explicitly state, if because of space considerations or something, you can't, right? It's a very big literature. You can always do things like, okay, you can directly state we are being very selective in this review, right? And maybe you can point to a review paper, right? And then you can focus on this, right? So, but it basically, all I'm saying is, and that's, I think, true for all the stuff that's coming up today. Think of it as like a checklist, right? I don't have like the perfect answer for all these things, but it's just like, keep in mind, this is one thing I should think about, right? And then the last point that we also talked about, right, is like, like a super high quality literature review is not a substitute for doing like good work of your own, but it's going to add both to the quality of your paper, and if you're known as somebody who consistently writes high quality reviews, right? I mean, it also reflects on you. They actually, because this is also kind of communicating to the reader, look, I have perspective. I know what I'm doing. I know how my work fits into the broader world. And I've actually took the pains to articulate this in a way that, right, that makes sense, right? So there's a lot of literature reviews that are boring and basically like a listing of things that have been done, and the reader's like, oh, this was done, and right. So if yours is not like that, right, it's another way it stands out. So I think there was a question or comment.
Yeah. So I think there is importance in consistency. So if I have, I'm working on a body of papers, right? in a
Yeah.
Specific field, and obviously there's a lot of overlap between the different papers. So do you think there's any value in having like a
Oh,
broader view of the
Oh.
reviews?
you mean for your papers, if
Yes.
there's more than one paper in the same area,
So-
right? Yeah. Yes.
Take
Oh,
perspective of consistency between them.
I mean,
Makes sense.
like if your earlier reviews were well organized, I think you can also refer back to them, right? I think now maybe there's a new dimension that over the years it developed, right? And you can still refer back to it, and you say, well, there's like these 3 or 4 dimensions to keep in mind. Refer to this paper and that paper for like details on those 3. And now here we're adding a new dimension or something, right? Yeah. So, but it's not. So I think definitely it makes sense to build on, like, to look up earlier work you did, right? But it's of course extremely difficult, if not impossible, to anticipate today, like how this lit, right? Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's see here. I think okay, 12. All right, so then so given this, right, I think the logical consequence is like I think at the end you want to aim to answer these questions. So basically, as the reader, when I'm done reading your literature review, right? SOA is like state of the art, and it's probably not a standard abbreviation, but that's what I mean by this. The state of the art. I guess you could add a T and then it's SOTA. I don't know, right? What do we know, right? Who contributed this knowledge and maybe when, right? And again, like this, all of these is in the relevant neighborhood of your paper, and the relevant neighborhood is, it's to some extent a judgment call. We'll talk a bit more about that, right? So so now here and this, there's some thoughts on this, right? So now if you're saying, okay, how broad do I need to go, or how focused should I be? There's a judgment call, right? So I think the first one is obvious. It's like, okay, so this is the problem I'm studying. I don't know, it's like a inventory management problem, or revenue management problem, or healthcare optimization problem, or machine learning problem, or something, right? So of course you can say, oh, this is my problem. Let me look in the neighborhood, and clearly I should talk about what else do we know about this. Right now, this could be, right? Like if you think of any research, right? This first is the question, and then you formulate it somehow as a problem, right? And here we have all like technically oriented people, so there's be some sort of mathematical problem and a mathematical model, right? And then also the solution, right? So now the contribution could be that, oh, this is like a completely new model, or maybe it's not completely new, but we take an existing model and we add something that's new, right? So maybe your contribution is not about the methodology, but it's going to be about, hey, once I add this new element to the model, suddenly the solution is very different from what we've done so far when this feature was missing, right? So again, like I can't give you the answer for this for your specific paper, but that's the obvious place to start, right? The second bullet point is kind of pointing to, try to at least a priori not have like too much of a tunnel vision, and say, okay, are there other things that are similar that maybe, it's not a priori obvious that I should also talk about them, but there's similar things that have been studied, right? So for example, you happen to have a problem that you kind of thought about it as a queuing model, but then there's actually inventory models that look at similar things, right? And they're like, if you just think queuing, right? You're not going to think of, oh, there's some people in supply chain management or inventories that are doing these things also, right? So here, the more experience you have, or the more you've read, or the more gray hair, or the less hair you have, right? The more you can make this judgment call without asking other people, right? So, but even then, right, it's never wrong to just say, hey, talk to your colleagues or friends or advisors or students sometimes, right? Students, like later you have students, they know stuff you don't know because they've gone into different directions, and say, hey, this is the kind of thing I'm working on. And that's why also conferences can be helpful, or talks, right? Not just to disseminate, but you get something, oh, this looks similar to something else I've seen, right? It doesn't mean that the problem is done and there's nothing to say, but again, right, so this may be another way that if there's something similar, and I'll give you a couple of examples later, it's definitely good, and sometimes it may be actually important to mention it, because other people, the readers who know a lot of stuff, they're like, oh, this looks similar to this. So if you tell them, oh, by the way, this is similar to this, and this is how this is different, right? They're like, oh, okay, yeah, right. If you don't say it and it's important, they're like, oh, there's something's missing here, right? Right. So then, okay, so now we know what kind of what's done. And then of course you need to know, okay, so what is new about this paper, right? And how will your paper fill this gap? right? And now again, it could be the question or the problem, or it could be a new model, or it could be, you know, the people have studied this model for 50 years and nobody could figure it out. But now we finally cracked this problem, right? And everybody's impressed how smart you are. I mean, that could be one type of contribution, right? But then I think also it's important to, like, you know, if it's just because it hasn't been done, doesn't mean that it should be done, right? So like, okay, first is like, oh, this is done, this isn't done. Now, of the stuff that isn't done, like, should we do it, right? And of course, you think it should be done because you've been spending a lot of hours on this or weeks, right? But we should also say, okay, so why should we care about this? And, you know, different people will disagree, right? Like people are very opinionated sometimes and they think, oh, this person is doing this totally useless work and I have no idea. And the other person is super excited about it, right? So, but at least you should present your case for why, you know, this would be relevant or significant, right? It could be practically relevant. It could be theoretically relevant, you know, ideally, maybe it's both. It's like you have some practical impact and some beautiful theory that could be, you know, very nice. Sometimes you might also find that people have actually in their conclusion said, oh, you know, these are some interesting, important, challenging, open problems or something, right? Now, if maybe you're actually studying so now when it gets tricky here is I think, and I'll show you one example of the three examples where at the surface, it doesn't seem like the model is very different, right? Like we've all seen papers where it's like, oh, X, Y, and Z did this problem. But, you know, they assume that the function is quadratic or something. And now I'm like, I can generalize this. It's not just, you know, any polynomial or, you know, any convex polynomial or something, right? And then you're like, okay, but is this just like a little tweak to this, right? So the more it's like close to a model that's been already studied, right? I mean, if there's really no news other than you had to redo all the proofs and add some extra terms in the algebra, then, you know, maybe it's not a great paper. But it could be that a small change in the model actually gives you, you know, important differences in the solution, right? And so then, you know, that would be important to emphasize here, right? And then you, of course, like in the literature review, that's like the first place where you mention it. The reader doesn't really know what you're doing, so maybe this is the first place to mention it. You can always come back to it after you've done the analysis, so then they can, you want to actually convince them that it makes a difference, right? Right, so basically at the end of this exercise, right, I think, you know, the question is, do you have a reasonable case that your paper expands the state of the art in some way that is important, right? Even though we're not like gonna cure cancer or solve, you know, climate change or something like that, right? But is like you, that's your job, right? And you want to be very articulate about this, right? So now, you know, the reader at least knows what you think is the contribution. Now they can decide, okay, like the rest of the paper is to kind of convince them that this is what you're actually doing. The way you represented it here is not overselling what you're doing, right? It's not inaccurate and so on and so forth, right? Let me stop here for a moment. Any questions or comments or, you know, I mean, I'm sure you guys have other insights that I didn't think of. Okay. All right. Yes, please.
David, you're saying that you have a paper and it's not that different from an existing model. I feel like oftentimes when that happens, someone did the research, didn't know about the other paper, and is now trying to sell it. So how would you position your lit review to sell that this is actually an important contribution, even if there is similar things?
Oh, you mean if you find yourself in a situation that you have a paper and then you find another one that's similar?
Yeah. Like position yourself to emphasize your contribution.
Oh, so I think, I mean, so okay, so I think I mean, the one example I will show you is where the results are actually very different, right? Now, there are sometimes cases where people in parallel, more or less, right, do similar work, right? And I mean, those things are tricky, but then sometimes, you know, you see this also in literature reviews where people say, oh, we're also like, there's also this paper. I mean, often these are like, I mean, hopefully this is not something that was done 10 years ago, right? But often it's like things that were done in a similar time frame. And then typically, I mean, I don't know how it works in each case, but I think usually the authors would somehow communicate, and then it's like, oh, this was done independently. And there's usually still some differences, right? Is that what you have in mind or something else? Oh, right.
General, like the only thing that's making it
Oh.
stand out.
I mean, I would I mean, I would work with that, right? Like, right? I mean, let's say that your model is more general, right? Or your method is more general, or works for a more general model. Um, but there's no clear like difference in the insights or the solution and so on, right? But yeah, it's like, okay, this is a more general model. I think probably you then want to maybe try to make a case for, you know, why this generality is important, right? Like, I mean, right? So, but it's, I know how these things go, right? Like you're like, well, you can say, right? So if it's just, and there's a gray zone there, right? It's like, if it's just like, oh, I can basically, so let's take the simpler model, run through all the steps, and it's like, okay, now let me generalize it a little bit. If I can still run through all the steps and it still works and it's like, it doesn't, you know, then it's going to be tricky, right? Then hopefully at least the two papers were sort of almost at the same time, and then maybe they can both be published or something, right? I don't know. Do you have something specific in mind, or you just discovered? Yeah.
There's the question of like if something should be published and
Oh,
how to
right.
get something published when you
Yeah.
sometimes I'm reading papers and I'm like, maybe this shouldn't. But
I mean, it could happen. I mean, I'm sure it has happened, right? Yeah.
so if you've already done a
Oh, yeah.
effort of research, you have to get it over the finish line somehow. So.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the risk is never zero, right? I think the risk can be somewhat reduced, at least on average, over longer periods of time if you have sort of your research network and you kind of know more what people are doing and so on. But yeah, it's not, yeah, that's kind of everybody's nightmare. Like, oh, this such a beautiful paper, and it's yeah. I mean,
For the conference papers that were the like very limited number of pages,
yeah.
What do you think about like still making sure that you're answering all the more
Oh, yes.
tricky
Yeah.
ones,
Yeah.
or sacrifice a couple of them to make sure?
Right, that's a great point. So I think I think it depends. So my thinking is, so the question is like for conference, like extended abstracts in particular, right? So you just want to get your paper accepted into the conference. Um, my impression is that people don't spend a lot of time reading these extended abstracts. Maybe I'm just telling you what I'm doing, right? So basically there, the most important thing is I mean, of course, there you do, I don't think you have to review the literature. There's like it depends, right? Are we talking, you know, depending on which field you are in, if you're like in CS or double E, you have like actually conference papers that are like, you know, journal quality. But if it's like an extended abstract for MSOM or, you know, something like that, I think the most important thing is that I should, even though they give you like 3 pages or something, I think in one page, and then you can add detail as needed. In one page, as the reader, I want to know, okay, what's your question and what do you think is new about it? And why should I care about this, right? And you don't have to like prove to me that there's nothing, like you don't have to actually give me all the papers, right? But you need to, at least in words, be able to say, okay, we're studying this problem. The literature so far has considered this and this, but they ignore this and this thing that we study, or this solution that we find, or this method that we develop is important because of this, right? So then they have the information, because typically you get assigned like X papers, right? And then there's one share of them where you just like, you don't even understand what is it you're doing and why is it, right? So I think with that, you're already like 80% in. Yeah. But giving the proof of all the papers is just no space, and people understand that, right? Yeah. Any other? Yes, please.
You mentioned what we do in the literature review. I mean, there's something that we don't want to do things. Is there an actual list?
Oh, like stuff to exclude?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things you want to exclude, right? I think so it's hard to say.
Common errors.
Like well, I think one thing is I mean, one problem so I think if you include something that is not really super relevant, I think that's not as bad as excluding something that's important, right? So like type 1, type 2 errors, I'm not sure which one is which here, right? But so like I would say in case of like, often there's space constraints, right? And the question isn't should I include this or not include this? It's like, should I include this or should I include something else? Right? And then you would, between those two things, decide which one is more relevant, right? Does that make sense? Right. So now if something is clearly irrelevant, and if you're not sure, you should check with people who know your work, like your advisor, your colleagues, right? And maybe like get some other inputs and so on, right? But often the problem is more, I would say, to omit something or include something and misrepresent it, like some right. So I think that the problem is not so much that you include it. The problem is that it may defocus your literature review, and it may be more indirect. That is like, oh, but that's nothing to do with this, right? So, right. So typically, after you sort of think about this, iteratively, I think the answer will be clear to you, if that makes sense. It's very high level, right? Okay. Okay. So then, so we talked about the goals and so on and so forth, right? So then, the next few steps here are more like, okay, how do I actually, like, the process, right? And so here, I think so a few things, right? So like, again, as I said at the very beginning, it's not like I'm the first person who writes a literature review or the only person who knows how to do this, or even the best person who knows how to do this, right? Like, we have to search, we have to sort of read, at least at some level, we have to evaluate, and then you want to organize and select the papers, right? I think one thing that's important, and it's not going to be a surprise to anyone with some experience, that this is often iterative, right? I think if you have less experience, it may be helpful to understand that this is an iterative process, and maybe not so easy process, because if you understand that that's in the nature of things, just like writing, right? Maybe you're not as frustrated that, oh, why is it so hard? Is it just me, right? It's probably not just you. It's just, there's a lot of ideas in these papers, and to organize everything, it just takes time and thought and repetition and refinement and so on, right? One thing I would say is, if you can, it would be helpful to have an organizing framework before you search. Or again, everything is iterative. Maybe you do a quick search, right? Or some brainstorming and some quick search, and then you come up with some organizing framework. And again, the framework is not going to be perfect, right? And it could be too complicated, so nothing fits into the framework, right? So this is more like um, um, I think it helps to not just like think of it as, okay, there's a bunch of papers out there, there's like N items. I'm just going to sequentially read 1, 2, 3, up to N. And then somehow, right, it helps to say, well, okay, so maybe I can think of application domains, right? That's one way. We have stuff in healthcare, we have stuff in, make to order, or we have like, manufacturing or something. What problem are they looking at, right? So if I look at ride-hailing papers, some people are looking at pricing, other people are looking at matching, other people are looking at, fleet size and so on and so forth, right? So, then like this and this one, they both have to do so with the model, like what are the assumptions, is a static model and so on, right? And so like to our earlier discussion, just because there's another paper that is on the same application and looks at the same decision, that doesn't mean, you have to go home and there's nothing more to do there, right? So maybe they look at a tactical problem that's a dynamic problem. And so, it's like, how do I adjust the price every minute or every 5 minutes or something? And, that's great, but there could still be an interesting, question on like, okay, what should be the prices in one part versus the other part of the network, like some more strategic or, bigger picture questions, right? So, and you can see that that's also why it takes time to actually, first you need to understand what they're doing, and then you need to reflect on it, and then you're like, okay, can we pitch it like this or like that, right? And then of course methodology, right? So maybe this is a well-known problem, a well-known model, and so on. But hey, the existing methods, we can beat them with our algorithm or with our methodology, right? Then when it comes to the search, I think I sort of like there's a lot of details on each of these slides, but I would like to think of like the short-term task, which is, oh, I have my paper and I need to add a literature review. And then the next slide is like the ongoing thing, which is like throughout your career, starting as students, right? And later into your career, right? You're kind of constantly being bombarded with like seminars and, archive and ResearchGate and SSRN and all these mailing lists. So there's constantly new papers coming in. And even though it's impossible to like absorb everything in real time, you can say, well, I can sort of, like short term, I have a very specific focus, longer term on an ongoing basis. And all of us do that. I think it's just good to sort of say, let me just, as a sort of background process every week, maybe I spend a few minutes. Okay, what's being written, talk to people and so on, right? So the short-term task is basically, right, you search relevant literature, right? What to search for, obviously, there's the obvious keywords, right? That goes back to, is it your problem, right? But then also, like, is it something similar, right? So what could be similar that doesn't immediately strike you as this is my problem, right? So it could be like what I mentioned earlier. It could be that, you have a queuing model, but there's inventory models that are sort of similar, right? Like if we're thinking of like a make to stock queue, that's very closely related to inventory theory, for example, right? Or in operations research, like one branch, like revenue management is, basically pricing and capacity allocation. Well, there's a lot of pricing work in marketing and econ, right? Now, finance is a different story. This is more like if we're looking at, the interface between operations and finance and so on, right? But so there might be a lot of work in economics. Not all of it is relevant, but some might be relevant to your paper, right? And then, are there techniques that you're building on that you just happen to have picked one technique for your problem, but then you're like, actually, this is just one out of, many similar techniques. Maybe I should go and like talk to an expert and say, okay, is there something methodologically there, or is it just a technique I'm using and I shouldn't emphasize, the technique itself, right? Now where to search, right? Like,
I have a question here.
please.
So my name is Rupinder. My question is for this part where you mentioned take a broader perspective to identify further important connections.
Yes.
So most of the time, it's very difficult to set up a boundary to identify those connections because since you're in the beginning, you're desperate to find all the connections so that maybe you can find a better problem. So is there anything that can help us to set up a boundary to identify those connections?
Well, I would think of I would think of starting first with your problem and working from there to say, okay, should I expand the perspective or not? I'm not sure whether that helps. Like, do you have a specific example in mind, or?
Not specific. It's just like when you are new to that specific topic, right? You literally do not know where this boundary should end. So
Okay.
that put you in a confusing state. For example, let's say if I ignore this part, am I missing something important here if I ignore this segment?
So I think do you work with an advisor or like?
So we should seek help from them.
If you, it depends on. I think it's never. I don't think it's ever wrong to like ask around.
Mhm.
Ask people you trust and to like you work with or your colleagues and so on. And like there's always going to be people who have more experience and more knowledge of specific areas, right? But I think maybe it helps to I think it helps to work from your problem, like start with what you're studying, because that one, right? Because you're studying it, presumably you understand it pretty well, right? You understand like you understand the nature of the, of course you know what the problem is, right? And then in studying the problem you discovered what is challenging, what is interesting, right?
Yeah, that's
So
right.
I would start with that, and then the first thing is really to see, okay, what else has been done on this problem, right? So I think I would definitely work from the problem you have, right? I think I can see what you're saying. Like if I start like with, oh, there's this whole literature, let's say I do some work on optimization. I'm like, oh, optimization. I don't think I'm the first person doing an optimization algorithm, right? It's going to be very difficult to like go top down. I think you would say, okay, so what are the special mathematical features of my optimization problem? What algorithms have been studied and so on, right?
Yeah,
So
that's
like
right.
like just in terms of direction, I would start with something that's narrow.
Okay.
That is definitely, because we also know that, right? You definitely have to include work that is on your problem, right? Like that one you must not miss in your literature review, right? That has to be there. So I would start with that first. And then even in reading this stuff, you're like, oh, maybe there's some other connections and so on, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And also I think also psychologically, I think it's important to not um be too anxious about missing something, right? Like um it, it, yeah, so right, like here I try to be kind of as broad as possible in this survey or in this, session here. Right? Like it's going to be a lot. It's going to be, it is a lot more important to not miss things that are closely related to what you're doing, right?
Mhm.
And people are going to be quote unquote less forgiving if you miss those things, right? Because like, well, they're studying this problem. How come they don't know what we know about this problem, right? Then when it goes into other important connections, I mean, to a degree, right? Like it's like a two-phase thing where first we say, okay, what are potentially connections? And then back to the earlier questions, maybe you look around and you read and you're like, well, actually, this is, it's kind of a stretch and we have a page limit and we're not going to include it, right? So yeah, so I hope this helps, right? So I mean, to summarize, start with your problem and work out from there, right? And as you do this, you will learn about the boundary and other things, right? And then if you're really stuck, ask other people who've worked on this, right? You can even ask people, who you're citing, right? And that's also the value of building a network over time.
Got it. Thank you so much.
And so here, right, so now, right, the papers by known experts, review articles and so on, right? You can also check, like you have a paper that you definitely think is relevant. You can see, okay, who's citing that paper or what paper cite that paper, right? And then we talked about consulting other people, right? The only thing I would say here is, you know, do your homework. I mean, this is not to scare anyone. Like you're definitely allowed to ask people. I would just say, don't just like, hey, I'm hi. Like, I mean, the more you know somebody, the better you know somebody, right? The more you can just ask like a blanket question, right? Maybe you've helped them out, right? Like, I mean, I have colleagues like this. Sometimes they just say, hey, we're starting to work on X. Do you have any thoughts or something, right? I'm not gonna say, oh, you guys are lazy, you should do your work first, because we know each other, we've worked on similar things, maybe they helped me on something and so on. But it's just like I would say, I mean, this is common sense, right? But I would say, okay, so this is the problem I'm working on. This is what I understand so far is relevant, right? So I think people understand, like if you approach them in the right way, I think people will, respond well, right? I think it helps to maybe be specific and not just basically, it shouldn't come across as, can you please do the literature review for me? It should be like, hey, I have some very specific questions and I'm not sure would this be relevant or something like that, right? And then, of course, your own database that you've developed over time. This brings us to the second part that I alluded to earlier, which is, you like over time, right? You learn not just like about methods and the field, but you also learn in terms of what people have done. And also you learn about how to connect something that you're doing with other things that may be not as obviously related because you've done this earlier, you've seen earlier connections, right? So, like develop your own database. It's not like we have to have a database, right? But you're reading papers, you see authors, right? I think it's helpful to try to, of course, over time, and even if you don't do this explicitly, you have some frameworks in your head, like, oh, this is how you think about the field. And then when you see new things, right, you can not just see, oh, this new thing is there, but you can say, oh, this fits in this bucket, and maybe it's also related to this bucket and so on, right? And I think this is definitely, of course, going to help in writing literature reviews, right? It may also help in identifying new directions for like future work. And of course, it will also maybe help you evaluate other papers, right? Because as a reviewer, sometimes, even if they cite all the papers and you're like, oh my God, I've never heard of these 5 papers. I'm sure they're relevant, right? So now the more of an understanding you have, right, I think the better, right? So here's some helpful habits, right? We can sign up to these mailing lists. I mean, on a personal note, right? I mean, sometimes it's a bit frustrating because there's so many cool looking papers coming into your mailbox and you're like, ah, I have no time to read them and so on. But, you know, at least you can maybe make a list of the ones that look like, oh, this is actually not just of interest for my general interest, but this is actually relevant to what I'm doing, right? And if you attend seminars and conferences and so on, right, you can skim, and then, you know, the ones that are really relevant, you can maybe read them more carefully, right? Yes, please.
Yes. So do you have a fourth habit of how to physically organize or
Oh.
manage this?
Yeah, I used to, but it seems to just be too much. So I think there's like good, there's all kinds of good apps these days that, right? I forget, you told me about one that you're using. I mean, what is it called again? Sotero? Sotero or something. So, I mean, I guess the problem is, I mean, so one thing I did for some time is, you know, like old fashioned, have like folders for different topics. And then I would just, you know, file them and so on.
But
Right.
you don't have to manage the information, it's all in your head.
And I mean, it's in the folders, but,
Yeah,
and
well,
I know where the folders are,
No, I
right?
mean,
Yeah.
like the papers.
Yes.
Stuff, but
Yes.
like
Yeah. No, I mean, I would skim what I put in the folders, right? Yeah. Yeah. But, you know, in 1 year, AI is going to replace us. We don't need to just, yeah. But I think there are apps where you can basically, you know, easily enter keywords and stuff like that. And it's going to cross, like the problem with folders is it just goes by one dimension, right? And then, yeah. Right. So, yeah. So, I mean, like the one thing I think that does help is, like, you know, I think the skim is something that like can be done relatively quickly, right? Skim the abstract. And maybe if it's like, oh, this is actually in the neighborhood of what I'm working on or might be working on, right? You can take a couple of notes, and it's not like it has to summarize the whole substance, but this is like an easy entry point when you actually might need to look it up, right? The other thing I would say maybe is that I think the learning here is in some sense non-linear, where I think once you accumulate a certain critical mass, even though there's lots of different things going on, right? I think the extra effort to fit the new thing into this thing is maybe not such a big incremental cost, right? When you're learning first, you're like, oh, how is everything related to everything else? Once you have that, at least for your field, I think it's, you know, there's a lot of new stuff, but it's not like everything is groundbreaking. So a lot of things fit into some pattern, right? Okay, so then, you know, so all of this was like about the search part, right? The read, evaluate, I mean, again, it's not like I have the secrets here. I would say some guidelines or some thoughts, right? So if you have a little bit of a framework, right, then as you kind of skim through papers, right, you can like just see how does this fit into this framework, how to position, right? Reading sequence, I mean, it's not like there's a magic formula for what to read first, right? But like if, of course, if you're an expert already, right, then you just read things as like when new things come available. If you're just completely new, right, maybe you want to start with a review article, right? Maybe with some of the key papers, or you want to start with, you know, your advisor or friend told you, oh, this paper is actually very similar to yours, but it's different, right? So maybe you start with that one first. And then again, it's all of this stuff is going to be iterative, right? So maybe you read some papers first, then you go back to simpler ones. So long story short, there's no magic formula here, right? But there's probably some heuristics that can help you, go somewhat systematically and not like totally random, right? Then individual papers, like again, this is just my take. So it depends what is the purpose for which we read these papers, right? If actually there's like a methodology that is super related to what I'm doing, then of course I will definitely go into the detailed proofs. If I just want to know, oh, there's this paper, it sounds similar to what I'm doing, then it's like, okay, what's the abstract? What do they think is the contribution? And then sometimes, right, this is pretty vague and hard to follow what they actually think they're doing. Once you're in the model, right, at least at that point, there's no more mystery unless the model is not well explained. Right. And then, of course, as you need to know more, you go into the details, right? I would definitely, right, so a lot of this could be skimming. I think anything that's closely related, right, you just have to go and like, right, to make sure, like basically you want to be in the best position to argue how your paper is different from this one or these ones, right? You don't want the referees to say, actually, this is really the connection that you missed, right? Because then that doesn't look very good, right? Take notes and so on and so forth, right? The other thing is in terms of organizing and selecting, right? If you have your initial framework, where we talk about applications and models and so on, right? You updated this as you learn more about things, right? You can then organize things along these lines, right? You may want to keep your framework simple. Like if you have like 7-dimensional framework, it may be just impossible to comprehend, maybe 1 or 2 main dimensions. Group the papers accordingly. Maybe then you identify the ones that are closer, right? At this point, maybe we also select some that we want to exclude or we have to exclude, right? You need to be selective, right? You think of who has the most fragile egos, who might reference the paper, referee the papers, right? And so on, right? And then when you write your review, keep in mind the goals, right? The goal is not to summarize all these papers, right? So one thing I personally don't like is literature review. Oh, there's this paper. They do this and this and this. There's that paper. They do that and that and that. And then there's the other paper. And then you're like, okay. So how does this answer the questions of what do we know and what is not known and what do you tell me in your paper? It's still unclear. I mean, it's maybe kind of if you as the reader do all the work, you can, reverse engineer this. But at this point, you're just annoyed with the writers because like, that's not my job. You're trying to convince me that your paper is worth publishing, right? So you want to explain first. So if you have an organizing framework, first say, okay, we're going to organize the literature review like this. And then you actually deliver on this organization. Don't start deviating from it, right? And then for each stream, you outline the papers and their relationships, right? Again, you don't need to summarize each paper, right? The detail depends on what is the point you want to emphasize. And then now the ones that are closely related, sometimes I think it's helpful to discuss them twice. One in the literature review, where you say, hey, there's this closely related paper. In a nutshell, this is how it's different. We'll come back to it after the analysis, because after the analysis, you actually understand what we did. And now I can use that detail to explain to you in detail how it's different, to basically convince you that what I claimed here at the early part of the paper is actually true, right? If I burden you with all the detail here, you're like, I don't even know what the model is, and right? Right, and that's really the goal, right? Critically articulate how your work differs from other papers and why these differences actually amount to important contribution, right? Okay. I think we have 14 minutes. I think that should be fine. So I'll just go quick on the examples. So the three examples are just three of my papers, and I'm just gonna briefly, like, the point is not to like teach you, like tell you about what these papers do in detail, right? It's more like the literature review part. Okay, so this paper here, I just put the picture with the model. Let's see that you guys can also see this. Okay, so so this is a multi-server queuing system, and we have multiple customer classes, and the goal of so service will be first in, first out. But you can see that these RIJs are the reward that I get if I match class I to server J, right? So the rewards are match dependent, right? And so the job here, the problem is to design the matching graph, right? So this matching graph is not given to us. We can choose it, right? And we want to do it in a way that considers two objectives. One, we want to ideally get as high of a matching reward as possible, right? So you want to create matches that have high RIJs, right? But you also want to keep the delays, the W's not too large, right? So this is kind of in a nutshell, the problem statement, right? So now basically it's a matching problem, right? We're interested in finding matching topologies. So basically think of these graphs that optimize the trade-off between two objectives, minimizing waiting times and maximizing the matching rewards, right? So now if you see this paper, you're thinking, wow, dynamic matching, there's so many papers, what could this possibly contribute to this, right? And indeed, once you start reading the literature, it's like your head starts spinning, right? So here what we did is, right, so this is about the organizing framework, right? So what we did is we said we're going to organize the literature based on key model features into multiple streams, right? And so you can see basically it has to do with is it a one-sided queuing system? Is it a two-sided queuing system? Is the compatibility graph fixed? Are the matching rewards dependent on the match and the rewards and so on and so forth, right? I'm not going to go into all the details, but essentially the one dimension is, in this big literature, you can think of sort of subcategories of models that people have studied, right? And then the second dimension is to say, okay, what are the key characteristics of what we focus on in this paper, right? And we actually spell it. So the key point is like we're spelling this out, right? Like we don't let the reader, you just you read this and you can figure it out in your head, right? Like there's these three features that set the focus of this paper apart from the literature. Number one is, right, we're optimizing over the matching topology, like we're choosing the graph. A lot of papers assume some fixed compatibility. The second thing is we're assuming that customers are served first come first serve, and there's a story in the paper on like public housing or something, or for fairness you can't just prioritize certain people. And there's other papers that actually focus on really like dynamic control, right, for a fixed matching topology. And then the other thing is that we have a trade-off between two performance metrics, the waiting times and the matching rewards, right? And so based on this, we then also say, as detailed below, right? And that's where we then have to actually, substantiate this claim. Either prior studies either differ in one or two or on three and so on, because they either, don't optimize the topology, or they just consider weighting, or they don't care about how the rewards depend on the match, and so on and so forth, right? So that's kind of example one. Example two is a paper which is basically, this is the picture for this. It's like the simplest model for this. So this is a paper which is kind of combining, pricing and priority design. Yeah, very good. Thank you. Right? It's so basically, if if you forget about the left side for a second, you have basically a 2-queue single server system, right? And the service provider needs to choose for each queue a price and an expected delay. In this model, both of these are static, right? So you can choose them, but then they're static. You're not dynamically updating them, right? And the goal is for the provider, they want to maximize revenue, right? So they can choose the W's and the P's. Of course, the W's must be achievable because you have, limited capacity, and there's like a on arrival process and so on. So you cannot just choose any arbitrary numbers, but you can choose these numbers subject to, there's a scheduling policy such that on average, like the long-term average waiting times will achieve those averages, right? The trick here is that we have customers. We have, in this case, just 2 customer classes. Each class is characterized by like a market segment that's like your potential arrival rate. And then a customer of each class is basically characterized by 2 numbers here. Their value for service. So let's say, this class, maybe they get $100 from getting served. And then there's a delay cost, which is per unit time, like $5 or $10 or $20 per unit time, right? And so there's a class 1 and there's a class 2, or a type 1 and a type 2, right? And the key is that when a customer shows up, they see this menu. They don't see the queues, but they can choose which one they, right? So they're basically going to say, okay, what is the price plus the expected delay? I'm going to choose the class that has the shorter price plus expected delay cost. And if that's lower than my willingness to pay, I will buy. If both classes are too expensive, I'm just going to go away, right? So so the challenge for the literature review, I mean, of course, to some extent, you need to differentiate this from queuing as well. But that's kind of simple because it turns out that surprisingly, nobody had looked at a provider that wants to maximize revenues, and the customers can choose between the classes, right? They had either looked at, I know who is 1 and 2, and I can just say, you guys choose this one, end of story, right? You're not allowed, right? Or they were looking at social welfare. And when you look at social welfare, it turns out that nothing new happens. I mean, it's still interesting to show that, but basically nothing new happens, right? So there's that differentiation. But then also in economics, right? Like if you don't think of queues, but if you think of just quality, right? Instead of W1 or W2, it's just a quality, and there's a cost to quality. And customers can choose, there's a long tradition in economics, right? So this is kind of the organizing framework here, is which I did first for a talk, and then it actually fit well for the paper, is to say, okay, and you can see here, this is also an opportunity for the literature review to kind of show like the big picture, and people are like, oh, there's some nice connections here, right? So so there I said, okay, so we have these 2 standard building blocks, right? This basically think for IE or people, this is just like queuing theory, right? And then you have for econ people, you have like mechanism design, right? You have people that can choose between different options, and there's incentive compatibility constraints and so on and so forth, right? Now, on top of these 2 building blocks, right, you have like by now like over 50 years of papers that do like queuing with economics, right? Basically, what this means is customers are deciding what to do. You can't just tell people what to do, right? The decision like, should you join or balk? That's the simplest one. And if you join, should you abandon? That's a little bit more subtle. Then also, should you do you want to buy this class or that class, right? If you're thinking of FedEx or Amazon, do you go with like 3-day delivery or 1-day delivery or something, right? And then basically I thought, well, actually, if you look at all these papers, right, you can think in the rows in terms of like what's the, like the supplier market structure, if you want, and objective. Like, is it just like a revenue maximizing monopoly, a social planner, or is it like competing firms that maximize revenues, right? If customers cannot choose between the classes, right? So basically, in other words, in terms of information, I know which segment you belong to, right? Then if you look at what is optimal from a scheduling perspective, either they assumed a fixed policy, or if you optimize over the policies, you can show that basically a delay cost minimizing policy would be optimal, right? So then even though you add all this economic stuff on top of it, what this means is this is how you should schedule. And then you just set the prices to regulate the arrival rates in a way that, achieves these objectives, right? If you allow for customer choice, like, so class one can choose between, type one customers can choose between the two classes and so on. If you actually say, I'm going to maximize social welfare, right? Nothing new happens. The interesting thing happens when it's the combination of revenue maximization and customers choosing, and you can choose the scheduling policy. Then, right, there's like things that are interesting. You want to maybe change how you schedule and how you do the delays, right? And then in the last minute, this is an example of a paper. So basically, the first paper here had like two customer types, right? This 2016 paper, which is with Mike Pavlin, who was a PhD student, right? Who's now um, Wilfrid Laurier. Yes, I knew W, and I knew it's not Waterloo, but the Laurier was Wilfrid, right? And so this is like a multi-type model, right? And just think of, so basically, like in principle, you can have basically this two-dimensional types, right? There's delay cost, and there's the value, right? And then in this model, at least the main model assumes that there's this affine relationship between the value of a customer and their delay cost, right? But basically think of this blue line, right? Right, so like basically in the earlier paper, there's like a C1 and a C1 and a C2 and basically a V and so on. So here basically there's multiple types. It's not fully general, but it's considerably more general, right? Well, it turns out there was prior work, including a paper by me where we hadn't thought about these things, or we hadn't even thought about this whole relationship. But if you actually translate it into this framework, the main difference is that there, in those models, the line intercepts below zero, right? So you're like, well, who cares? That's like almost the same thing, like, right? And we didn't actually try to optimize the scheduling. We just assume you do priorities and so on, right? But then it turns out that this makes all the difference, because if you allow this to intercept over here, then, and there's no time to explain it, but basically, why should we care about this difference, right? Basically, now what happens is that depending on whether you offer a fast service, so think of a P plus CW that has a small slope, right? The W is low, or a slow service where the W has a big slope, right? It changes who prefers this class, right? So basically, that's what we call lead time dependent ranking. And as a result, these three results, right? None of these results occur in the prior model, right? Again, there's no time to like go and explain what it is and so on, but these are like striking features of the optimal solution. And so there now this is very tricky to explain in the literature review because people are like, I don't even know what you're doing, right? So there, what we did is basically to say, right, it's difficult to fully appreciate in the literature review. It's complicated, right? So what we did there is in the literature review, we outlined, listen, you may be aware of other papers, but actually this is, in our model, the ranking of these customers depends on, are you offering slow or fast service? And this makes all the difference. And then there's a full section dedicated to returning to these results after the analysis where it says, okay, let's look at this paper, let's look at that paper, and so on, right? So anyway, so so this is end of examples, right? So I think one mistake is if you have some closely related paper, some people are just like, yeah, there's this other paper, it's closely related, and then, and then they leave it up to you. And you're like, but you have to explain this to me, right? So you want to just address it and you basically take control of this and you say, look, we know there's this work. And of course, hopefully there's something good to say about how it's different, but you need to make this effort and then people actually appreciate it. The other thing is like a list of things. Well, I read this paper, I read that paper, and you're like, what is the point of this? And then sometimes you also have things where people, and I've seen this also, they cite one of my papers, and I'm like, that's great, but they say they do this. I'm like, no, we don't do this. But it's okay, right? So, but these are things hopefully you can avoid. And anyway, so that's what we discussed earlier, and that's sort of the main point. So thank you. So we just smashed. I guess it was 83 minutes in the end. So
Thank you, Professor.
thank you for coming online or in person. Yes, there's some time. I mean, I think we need to go probably at 1:40, but there's 7 minutes. I can still be here. Is any? No questions. Great. There's sandwiches if you're on. Sorry if you're online. That's what you're losing. Sorry.
Try that AI random figures.
Oh yeah, I mean AI. You can definitely. Sorry, I didn't mention it. I guess. Yeah. Sorry. You definitely should. You should definitely also. I think. I mean, these days, if you do even on Google, right, it's getting stuff from AI. Yes, absolutely. What I didn't address is like telling AI to write your literature review, right?
Should we do that?
No, it wasn't on the mistakes slide.
Yeah. So I should. Okay. So sorry. So I should clarify that. This talk did not. I did not think hard about AI. So, I mean, definitely people are using AI to search for things. I'm pretty sure that people are using AI to draft literature reviews, right? I mean, I think one thing I would say is, I mean, and people have been adopting this at various speeds, right? I think one mistake I would avoid if you use AI, I don't think it's like, I'm sure that if you do a survey, probably you'll find like over 50% of people are using AI in some form for the literature review or even to draft a literature review. I think the mistake there would be to not like carefully, but that's true for any AI use, right? Check. So I think AI would not be, in my mind, a substitute for you doing. I think it can help you find it. It can probably help in every phase of what we discussed. But I mean, at least my personal thing is I would actually want to read the papers, right? And then read and change the draft of the literature review. Right? Because sometimes it also hallucinates about papers that don't exist and so on, right? So yeah, but that's a great question. I guess I should have yeah. Like you can apply all these principles, just basically apply all of this, just say, you can use AI to help you with all of these things, but I would make sure that at the end you're in charge, the final voice on each of these points.
Upload the presentation to the prompt.
Yeah,
Make sure they avoid.
that's right. Yeah.
Actually, that's
sometimes when I search the articles by keywords, there are some articles that they do the similar things, but they use totally different technologies to.
Yeah.
That there are some technologies I cannot imagine that. So how can I avoid this kind of things?
I mean, to some extent, you need to then, you know, expand your search criteria and so on, right? And also, I mean, to some extent, it's you just have to, you know, filter it out, right? I mean, I think the more experience you have, right, like the less you would like the better you know a field, right? The less you would rely just on these keyword searches, right? Right. So I mean, off right. But it's true that if you just do a keyword search, yeah. I mean, I think it's also a function of where do you do the keyword search. If you just go on Google and do a keyword search, you get different results than if you go to like you know, SSRN or Archive or ResearchGate or like, right? So sometimes, right? Yeah. For this, I think probably it may be, even in this day and age, there may be actually some value in like spending half an hour with a like expert librarian who, you know, they've thought a lot about how to search for things and so on and so forth, right? But yeah, like I mean, there's gonna be some wasteful searching in the sense that, right, it's not like everything you find is relevant and it finds everything that's relevant, right?
I mean, I think that some people might use a totally different words to describe things.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well,
I mean, the simple answer to that is hopefully everyone in your field isn't equally as blind to that, which means that they'll have cited them in their lit review, so you can just click the search and see what they cited. So if you find a really relevant paper, hopefully their lit review shows you.
yeah, hopefully the number of people who use different words for the word everybody else is using is not a big number, but yeah.
Leverage everyone else's experience.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, maybe I can stop.